There's a memory I carried for years like a scar that never quite healed. I was 9 years old, standing in the schoolyard during recess, and a group of kids started laughing at the color of my skin. I remember everything about that moment with the kind of clarity that only trauma can produce. The hot sun on the back of my neck, the sound of the playground, swings creaking, basketballs bouncing, the distant shout of a teacher telling someone to slow down, the smell of asphalt after rain, and then the laughter, not the good kind, the kind that has a target. I remember looking down at my hands like I was seeing them for the first time, like maybe if I stared hard enough I could understand what was so funny, what was so wrong, what was so different about me that a group of kids I'd known since first grade suddenly looked at me like I was something foreign, something less. I was 9 years old, and someone had just introduced me to the concept that my skin, the thing I was born in, the thing I couldn't change any more than I could change the color of the sky, was something to be mocked. I didn't cry in the schoolyard. I want to be clear about that. 9-year-old me had too much pride to cry in front of the people laughing, so I swallowed it, pushed it down somewhere deep in my chest where it sat like a burning coal for the rest of the school day. I went through the motions, math class, lunch, reading, all of it happening in some parallel version of my life while the real me was somewhere else entirely, replaying those 30 seconds over and over, trying to figure out what I should have said, what I should have done, whether I should have cried or yelled or laughed back or walked away or stayed and made them understand exactly what they'd just done. The walk home took 11 minutes. I know because I'd timed it once with a stopwatch as a kid obsessed with numbers and records. That day, it felt like 11 hours. Every step was heavy with something I didn't have the vocabulary for yet. Later, I'd learn the word, dehumanization. But at 9, all I knew was that I felt smaller than I had that morning, like the world had shifted slightly on its axis and I'd lost my footing without anyone noticing. My father was in the kitchen when I got home. He was still in his work clothes, the ones that always smelled like machine oil and something metallic that I associated entirely with him. He was making coffee, which meant he'd just gotten home too, which meant whatever was about to happen would be happening in the kitchen with the afternoon light coming through the yellow curtains my mother had picked out. Normal, domestic, completely at odds with the storm inside me. He looked up when I came in. Fathers have a radar for when something is wrong with their kids. Mine had it tuned perfectly. He didn't ask if I was okay because he could already see I wasn't. He just set down his coffee cup, leaned against the counter, and waited. That was his way. He never rushed toward your pain. He let you bring it to him on your own terms. I dropped my backpack on the floor, which I wasn't supposed to do, and he didn't say anything about it. Then I told him everything. The laughter, the words, the kids' names, the way they looked at me, the way no one else in the schoolyard said anything, the way the teacher on duty was busy on the other side of the playground. I told him about standing there with my hands at my sides and not knowing what to do with my body, not knowing whether to make myself bigger or smaller. I told him about the rest of the school day and how I'd sat next to those same kids in reading class and had to pretend everything was normal. I told him I wanted to change schools. I told him I wanted him to go there tomorrow and make it right. I told him I was angry and I was hurt and I needed him to do something because that was what fathers were for. He listened to all of it without interrupting once. His face did something complicated while I talked. Not the explosion I was hoping for. Not the righteous parental fury that would send him marching to the principal's office first thing in the morning. Something quieter and somehow heavier than anger. When I finally ran out of words, when the whole story had been emptied out of me and I was standing there breathing hard and waiting for him to launch into action, he did the thing that broke my 9-year-old heart. He put his hand on my shoulder, And he said, "Stay quiet, don't say anything." I stared at him. Surely I'd misheard. Surely those couldn't be the words that came out of my father's mouth in response to what I'd just told him. Stay quiet. I'd been quiet all day. I'd been so quiet that the burning coal in my chest had nearly scorched me from the inside out. I'd been quiet through math and lunch and reading and the 11-minute walk home, and I was done being quiet. I needed him to be loud. I needed him to be the dad in the movies who shows up at the school and terrifies everyone into treating his kid right. I needed justice, and he was offering me silence. I pulled away from his hand. I told him he didn't understand. I told him he didn't care. I told him that if he wasn't going to do anything, then I would handle it myself, and I didn't need his help. I picked up my backpack and went to my room, and I stayed there until dinner, which I ate in near silence, answering his questions with single syllables and refusing to meet his eyes. 9 years old, and I was giving my father the full cold shoulder treatment because I thought he'd failed me. The thing about childhood wounds is that they don't heal the way scraped knees do. They don't scab over and fade. They get incorporated. They become part of the architecture of who you're becoming, the scaffolding of the person being built inside you. And you don't always know which parts are load-bearing until you try to remove them and the whole structure shakes. That moment in the kitchen became load-bearing. It became the story I told myself about my father and, by extension, about myself. He didn't fight for me, which meant either he didn't think I was worth fighting for or he thought that the appropriate response to being disrespected was to take it quietly. Neither option was acceptable to me, so I filed the memory under evidence and moved on. Middle school made it worse. Adolescence has a way of amplifying everything that already hurts, turning the volume up on wounds that were already loud enough. The questions about identity that start whispering in elementary school start screaming in middle school. Who are you? Where do you belong? What does your face mean to the world? I was already primed for these questions, already had a framework built around the idea that the world would sometimes look at my skin and decide something about me before I opened my mouth. And I'd decided that my response to that would always be loud. I became the kid who argued. Not the troublemaker kind of arguing, not the disruptive kind, but the principled kind that teachers found simultaneously impressive and exhausting. If someone said something I thought was unfair, I said so. If a lesson glossed over something that mattered, I raised my hand. If a joke landed wrong, I explained why it landed wrong, whether anyone wanted the explanation or not. I thought I was being brave. I thought I was being everything my father wasn't on that afternoon in the kitchen. I thought the opposite of his silence was my constant noise. High school sharpened it into something more focused and more dangerous. I found language for what had been happening to me. I found history. I found a tradition of resistance and righteous anger that told me my instinct to fight back was not just acceptable, but necessary. And I leaned into it with everything I had. I was not going to be quiet, not for anyone, not ever. The irony is that I was exhausted by 11th grade, not from the fighting itself, but from the constant readiness to fight, from living in a state of permanent preparation for the next attack. I didn't realize it at the time because I'd normalized it. This is just what it means to move through the world in this skin. You stay ready, you stay sharp, you make sure no one gets a free shot, but the readiness has a cost, and I was paying it out of my sleep and my focus and my relationships without knowing it. College was where things started to fracture. I was doing well academically, had good friendships, was involved in organizations that mattered to me. On paper, I was thriving, but I was also getting into arguments that went nowhere. Not debates, because debates have a structure and a purpose. Arguments. The kind that start on social media at 2 in the morning and bleed into real life. The kind where you're typing responses with shaking hands to someone who isn't going to change their mind no matter what you say, whose whole purpose in engaging with you is to watch you get upset. I knew this, and I kept doing it anyway because backing down felt like surrender, and I had decided a long time ago in a kitchen with yellow curtains that surrender wasn't an option. Sophomore year, I lost a friendship over an argument that started online. We'd been close for 2 years, had shared meals and study sessions and late-night conversations about everything that mattered. We disagreed about something political. It escalated. Things were said that couldn't be unsaid. And in the wreckage of that, I sat in my dorm room trying to figure out when exactly I decided that being right was more important than being in relationship. I couldn't find the moment. It had happened so gradually that I'd missed it entirely. I called my father that night. Not to talk about the friendship or the argument. We hadn't had a real conversation about anything vulnerable in years. I called just to hear his voice, which even now I'm not fully able to explain. He picked up on the second ring the way he always did and asked how I was doing, and I said fine, and he said good, and we talked about nothing for 20 minutes. And when we hung up, I felt slightly less like the world was ending without knowing why. It wasn't until I was 26 that the real reckoning happened. I was working my first real job, post-grad, at a marketing firm in a city far enough from home that I felt like a different person than the one my parents had raised. I was good at my job, driven, creative, willing to put in the hours. I'd built a solid reputation in 18 months and was being considered for a promotion that would change the trajectory of everything. There was a colleague, I'll call him David. David was charming in the way that certain people are charming, effortlessly, thoughtlessly, in a way that meant he'd never had to work very hard to be liked. We weren't friends, but we weren't enemies. We existed in the professional middle ground of people who share a workplace without sharing a life. One afternoon in a team meeting, David made a comment. It was wrapped in the language of a compliment, which is the most insidious packaging for something ugly. He said in front of 8 other people that I was surprisingly well-spoken for someone from my background. Surprisingly well-spoken for someone from my background. I felt the kitchen again, the hot coal in my chest, 20 years later, same temperature. And this time I didn't swallow it. I said in front of all 8 people in the clearest voice I could produce that he might want to unpack what he meant by surprisingly and by background, because I was having a hard time hearing it as anything other than condescending. The room went very quiet in a way that rooms only go quiet when something has shifted irrevocably. David apologized. Red-faced, stumbling, the kind of apology that's more about managing his own discomfort than addressing mine. The meeting continued, and on the surface I had done the thing. I had not stayed quiet. I had named it. I had demanded accountability in real time in front of witnesses. But the hours that followed were some of the most miserable of my professional life, not because of David, because of what happened in my own head. I spent the rest of the afternoon replaying the moment from every angle, calculating the political fallout, worrying about how each person in that room had interpreted what I'd said, wondering if my manager thought I was difficult, wondering if this would be held against me in the promotion decision, cycling through whether I'd been too aggressive or not aggressive enough, and whether there was a version of that moment where I could have handled it perfectly and what perfect would have even looked like. David was taking up 40 square feet of floor space in that building and approximately 80% of my mental real estate. I'd won the moment and lost the day. I drove home that night with a headache that sat behind my eyes like a fist, and I sat on my couch in the dark for a long time before I could make myself eat dinner. And then, for the first time in almost 2 decades, I thought about my father standing in the kitchen with his coffee and his machine oil smell and his hand on my shoulder. Stay quiet, don't say anything. And I thought, what if I'd had it backwards this whole time? Not all the way backwards, not completely wrong, but what if there was something in what he was trying to tell me that I'd been too hurt and too young and too certain to hear? I drove home for Thanksgiving that year with a question I'd been carrying for months. The house was the same as always, the same yellow curtains now faded, the same smell of whatever my mother was cooking that meant everything was okay. My father was in the garage, which was also the same, always in the garage, always working on something with his hands, as if stillness was a thing he could only afford in measured doses. I sat with him out there for a while, not saying anything, watching him work the way I used to do as a kid before the kitchen and the cold shoulder and the years of distance we'd never fully closed. And then I asked him. I told him I'd been thinking about that day, the schoolyard, the kids, the kitchen. I told him I'd thought about it more than I'd ever told him. I asked him why. Why stay quiet? What he was thinking when he said that. What he thought it would do for me. He didn't stop working. My father thinks better with his hands moving, always has. He was quiet for long enough that I started to wonder if he'd heard me. Then he said something that rearranged everything. He said, I knew exactly what you needed me to do that day. You needed me to be angry. You needed me to storm the school and put my hands on someone and make the world feel fair. And I understood that need because I had it too. I was angry. I want you to know that because I don't think I ever told you. I was so angry that I had to hold on to that counter to keep myself in the room. My child came home hurt, and I couldn't fix it with anything simple. And the part of me that wanted to fix it the simple way was very loud that afternoon. He paused, set down whatever he was holding, looked at me the way he rarely looked at me, directly without the deflection that men of his generation used to avoid being seen too clearly. But I also knew something you didn't know yet. I knew that those kids were going to keep existing in the world, and the world was going to keep having people like them in it, not just kids, but grown adults with authority and platforms and legal systems behind them. And if I taught you that the answer to every person who looked at your skin and decided something was to fight them, was to engage, was to prove yourself, was to spend your energy making them understand what they'd done wrong, I would be sending you into the world with a strategy that would destroy you, because there are too many of them and only one of you, and you cannot afford to spend yourself that way. He picked up his work again, hands moving. I wasn't telling you to accept it. I want you to hear that. I was telling you to decide what it was worth. That particular moment, those particular kids, what were they worth? Your anger, your afternoon, your peace, were they worth carrying for 20 years the way you've been carrying them? Because I could see that you were going to carry it. I know how you're built. You're built like me. We pick things up and we don't put them down. So I wanted you to start learning early which things deserved to be picked up and which things needed to be left on the ground. He looked at me again. The silence wasn't about them. It was never about them. It was about protecting the space inside you where you build your life, because the moment you gave those children a reaction, you gave them a room in your head. And some people will live in that room for decades if you let them. I didn't want that for you. I wanted you to walk past them and go home and do your homework and dream about what you were going to become. I wanted them to be irrelevant, and the way to make someone irrelevant is to treat them as though they are. I didn't have a response, not immediately. I sat in the garage with the smell of motor oil and sawdust and the late November cold coming in under the door, and I turned what he'd said over in my mind like he was turning wood in his hands, looking at it from every angle, testing its weight. He wasn't telling me injustice didn't matter. He wasn't telling me to be passive or invisible or to accept mistreatment without record. He was telling me something more precise than that. He was telling me about the economy of my own attention, that not every provocation is an invitation that deserves an RSVP, that some things are specifically designed to cost you your energy, your focus, your time, your peace, And the most subversive thing you can do is refuse to pay. I thought about David, about the meeting, about the hours I'd lost to cycling through the fallout of a moment that lasted 45 seconds, about all the arguments I'd had in college that I'd lost friendships over, about the comment sections and the social media battles and the late nights typing furious responses to people who would wake up tomorrow and not remember my name, about all the space I'd rented to people who were not paying me anything in return. I thought about what my life would look like if I got that space back, if every time someone threw something at me designed to make me react, I had the discipline to evaluate whether they deserved the reaction, not to suppress what I felt, not to pretend the world was fair when it wasn't, but to choose, to actually choose, to be sovereign over my own attention instead of surrendering it to whoever was loudest or most provocative on any given day. My father handed me a cup of coffee, the way he always did in the garage when the conversation had gone somewhere real. We didn't hug it out. We didn't cry. We sat there in the cold and drank bad coffee, and that was the conversation. That was the closing of something that had been open for 20 years. I went back to work the following Monday with something different in my chest, not the burning coal, something cooler and more deliberate. When David caught my eye in the hallway and gave me the slightly stiff nod of someone who's still embarrassed, I nodded back without any edge in it. Not because what he'd said was okay, not because I'd forgiven him in any profound way, but because he had gotten exactly as much of me as that moment warranted, and I was done paying interest on it. The promotion came through 6 weeks later. I'm not telling you that silence is always the answer. It isn't. There are moments that demand your voice, injustices that require witnesses, systems that only change when people get loud and organized and refuse to be ignored. The silence my father taught me was never about accepting everything. It was about choosing what you accept, what you fight, and what you walk past. It was about understanding the difference between battles that will build your life and noise that will only drain it. Because here's what I know now, standing on the other side of the reckoning my father tried to give me at 9. The people who hurt you want you to be hurt. Not all of them are conscious of this. Some of them are just broken and leaking their brokenness onto whoever is nearby, but whether it's conscious or not, your reaction is what they're after. Your anger confirms their narrative. Your engagement gives them significance. Your distraction benefits them directly, and your peace, your actual peace, the kind where you wake up in the morning with space in your mind for what matters to you, that is the most radical thing you can protect. The kids in that schoolyard were not powerful. They were 9 years old and repeating something they'd heard somewhere that made them feel bigger by making me feel smaller. The real question was never what they thought of my skin. The real question was what I was going to do with the room they'd taken up in my mind for the next 2 decades. Was I going to let them be significant? Was I going to build my entire relationship to myself around the need to prove them wrong? Was I going to spend my life reacting to that 30-second moment on a Tuesday afternoon in the schoolyard? My father said no, not by explaining it, by showing me, by squeezing my shoulder and saying, stay quiet, and trusting that one day, even if it took 20 years, I'd understand what he meant. I have a child now, not yet school age, still at the stage where the world is entirely safe because I'm in it, the way the world was entirely safe for me when my father's hand was around mine. I know what's coming. I know that one day someone is going to say something to my child that lands like a slap. And I know I'm going to feel the impulse to storm whatever school or playground or comment section and make the world feel fair in the simple way, the immediate way, the way that feels like action. And I know I'm going to have to decide in real time with my child looking at me, waiting to see what strength looks like, what I'm actually going to teach them, whether I'm going to teach them to react to every provocation with heat, to stay permanently ready for the next attack, to spend their energy defending against people who will never deserve it, or whether I'm going to put my hand on their shoulder and give them the gift that cost my father his voice that afternoon in the kitchen, that cost him his child's good opinion for years, that he gave anyway because he loved me more than he needed me to understand him. I'm going to stay quiet, and then later, much later, when they're old enough, I'm going to explain why. I'm going to sit in a garage or a kitchen or wherever we end up, and I'm going to tell them that their peace is the most valuable thing they own, that their attention is a currency, and some people are trying to rob them of it every single day, that not every battle deserves their presence, that silence isn't weakness, it's selection. It's the decision to be sovereign over your own mind instead of handing that sovereignty to whoever is loudest or cruelest or most desperate for a reaction. So I want to ask you something before you go. Who is living rent-free in your head right now? What person or moment or comment from days or months or years ago is still taking up space in your mind, still dictating your mood, still costing you sleep and focus and peace? What reaction are you giving right now, today, to someone who doesn't deserve a single second of your energy? Because your attention is your life. Where it goes, your life follows. And every moment you spend being a reaction to someone else's smallness is a moment you're not spending building the thing you actually came here to build. My father was not a loud man. He didn't fill rooms with his presence or his words. He filled them with something quieter and harder to name. The kind of steadiness that comes from a person who has decided deeply and deliberately what they will and won't give their energy to. I've spent years reading that steadiness as passivity. I know now it was the most disciplined thing I've ever witnessed. He taught me to stay quiet, not because the world didn't matter, but because I did. Because my peace mattered. Because my future mattered. Because the space inside me where I would build my life was sacred enough to protect even from my own reactive impulses. That's the lesson. It took me 20 years and a lot of lost energy to really hear it. But I'm passing it forward now, the same way he passed it to me, without apology, without needing you to understand it immediately, trusting that one day you will. Stay quiet, not because you're weak, because you're free.